So hello and welcome to this Einstein Forum webinar. My name is Misha Gabovic. I'm a researcher at the Einstein Forum. And this is very much a first for us. We've not done anything in this format before. But at the Einstein Forum, we pride ourselves on always taking much more time for the post-lecture discussions than other institutions. And we wanted to try and replicate a little bit of that in this online format, which is why after Benjamin Zachariah's lecture, which has been online for a few days, we decided to have a separate webinar where people will be able to ask questions and engage in a little bit of discussion. So we talked in our own little discussion after your talk, mostly about ties between fascisms in what is now often called the Global South, specifically India, and European fascisms. I was wondering if you could say a few words about horizontal ties between fascist movements in non-Western countries. So are we talking, especially if we're talking about, let's say, the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, are we talking about kind of a spike model with fascist ideology radiating out of a European core and then being maybe absorbed in a country like India? Or is it more a matter of a much more messy and complex horizontal circulation of ideas globally?
I mean, I think it's quite a lot messier than we would normally think. There are two sides to it. One is, of course, that the ideas that go into fascism and that go into fascism when it becomes a regime, first in Italy and then in other places, they've been around a long time. They are 19th century ideas in many cases, and they are not specific to Europe or non-Europe. They are actually very much circulating in a public domain, which is empires and counter-empires and rivals to empire across the world. You could take an example which is at first glance not a very political one, that of theosophy, which I think I mentioned already. And that's at the same time Russian as it is American, as it is Indian, as it is Austrian, and so on and so forth. So that's the background. Then in more classical times, if you like, after there is a regime somewhere, then I think what I call it is a voluntary Gleichschaltung. So kindred ideas from across the world start to recognize one another. Groups that are thinking in similar ways start to gravitate towards one another and at least take on some of the characteristics and certainly the language of legitimation of its more successful partners. So in the first instance, that is Italian fascism, and with a little more time, it becomes Nazi Germany. But in fact, the people, the personnel who interact with, say, the Italian fascists or the German Nazis, or in some cases move between, and this is a case that needs more study, between Ireland and India. Both the Irish case and the Indian case have an interesting set of resonances where a kind of Völkisch ideology gravitates towards seeking affinities with Nazi and fascist entities. So I think it's both ways. I think the problem has been that if you start from the classical period alone, then there is a Europe first and elsewhere model. But I think that's an effect of the voluntary Gleichschaltung. That's an effect of trying to see Europe as the first inventor of the regime phase, and therefore everybody trying to catch up.
Right. Okay, I think we'll get back to this question of Ireland and India at some point, because I think this relationship between two colonies or former colonies of Britain is especially interesting in a historical context. But first I want to take this question from, and I do apologize to everyone whose names I'll be mispronouncing, Martin Hamre, who says, what did you actually mean when you referred to disavowed internationalism in your presentation? Historians used to focus on fascist ultranationalism as a contradiction to internationalism. Would you disagree?
Well, I mean, that's why it's a disavowed internationalism. If you are able to say we're just like the fascism around the corner, then you can't make that ultranationalist claim. That, I mean, this is in several ways the romantic assertion that we have some kind of mystic inner selves as a nation, and that the way to discipline that nation into a proper being is to act as an organic collective entity. So, of course, I find that the public rhetoric is contradictory to suggest that there's a fascism. I mean, some other people have been raising the question about the current day question of what is now called ethno-pluralism, and which some of us would call cultural ghettoism or global Bantustans. So everybody has their own cultural or national entities, and they should be free to develop them separately but equally. And this, again, would become the question of a functioning cross-fascist collaboration. The problem there is whenever fascists in power are forced to collaborate, then we have a problem, because there's the question of in what hierarchy and in what chain of command they will collaborate. Now, this is solved in World War II by the Nazis basically occupying and administering other lesser fascist countries in Europe. But this becomes a serious problem when you're not just saying separate entities, separate spaces, but how are we to deal with rival fascisms?
Maybe as a quick follow-up to that, when fascism is in power and actually has to deal with these questions pragmatically, do you see a strong influence of the original racial ideology in the way that they deal with these issues? Or does the response tend to be entirely pragmatic? So, when, for example, the National Socialists start occupying countries and also forging alliances with enemies of their enemies, is there a strong element of, hang on, we said these people were only half Aryans, so we can't really, upgrade them to three-quarter Aryan status now? Or do you find that it's purely based on expediency?
Well, there's a lot more pragmatism when there's a power equation going. So there was a short book some years ago by Sophie Wagenhofer about the pragmatics of Nazi collaboration with the Arabs. And she makes it clear that they may be the racial enemies, but in a number of situations, you would seek an alliance with strategic elements of Arab leadership. Obviously, there's a very strong anti-fascist movement in many Arab countries, so you can't just collaborate with the Arabs in general, which is actually one of the problems of the literature. So I think, of course, it was pointed out very early by a nephew of the poet Rabindranath, who was a communist in Berlin. And he wrote, I think it was the first book talking about the concentration camps. We're not talking about the organized camps now, but the so-called informal camps, which say turn up in the cellar of a grocery store owned by a pro-Nazi. And he was actually talking very clearly about violence in Nazi Germany, but he addressed some of this to an Indian audience. And he said, although many Indians think that they are Aryans, the Nazis should be are clear about this, that Indians are degenerate Aryans, they've miscegenated too much. So be careful what affinities you seek. On the other hand, the Nazis themselves were perfectly capable of making pragmatic alliances when it came to pragmatic alliances.
Right. And in the Soviet case, there is some interesting recent research that shows that Nazi attempts to forge a sort of anti-Bolshevik army out of non-Russian minorities in the Soviet Union were partly thwarted by their own racism, because the specific people who were put in charge of this project often were so racist that they simply couldn't put enough trust in the people that they were supposed to train. But that, of course, is a very specific case. So I'm going to read out another question in a second. I just want to remind everyone that you should type in your questions not in the general chat, but using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And I know this is confusing. I think I made a mistake myself at the beginning of this recording. So Susan Niemann, the director of the Einstein Forum, says, thank you for your lecture. Could you be a little bit more specific about the ideas that are the backbone of fascism? What is a völkisch identity? Is it just racism, nationalism, plus authoritarianism? And I guess this takes us back to the question we briefly talked about the fascist minimum versus the fascist repertoire?
I mean, there's an argument as to how far a Völkisch identity requires an idea of religion, or how far it requires an idea of race. And I think that because many of these ideas are simply asserted and repeated, it's going to be very difficult to actually find a repertoire of the Völkisch. What I can say, for instance, is that when a kind of romantic assertion of nationalism does the rounds, that is not a nationalism that emerges from some kind of asserted civic belonging. Now, civic and ethnic are problematic and very incomplete categories, but nonetheless, a civic nationalism cannot use the folk as its legitimation, an ethnic nationalism can. So that's the distinction I'm making there. But when you have a Völkisch nationalism, it essentially asserts the authentic belonging of a certain entity of people. Now, in the Indian case, the category that is most often selected for this is Hindu. And the problem there is if you take only upper caste Hindus, you cannot create a majority. So then there's a resort to something which, in the words of Binoy Sarkar, who was one of the major proponents of this Völkisch nationalism, there is the folk element in Hindu culture, and that is much more stable and much more inclusive than a kind of caste Hindu culture. Now, this folk element idea, for which he cites various early proponents of German nationalism like Herder, is something that he has no doubts about. It's something that is authentic, that is felt, that is instinctive. I mean, you know this from Nazi ideas of the strong, sturdy Aryan versus the devious Jew. So you constantly need the counter image. The interesting thing about fascism is it also had proponents who, for instance, were quite famous as Muslim nationalists, like Muhammad Iqbal, who studied at Heidelberg. And Iqbal believed that the idea of the Ummah in Islam is very compatible with an idea of the Nazi folk. It's not really something you can define in an equation because it's not an intellectual argument. It's an assertion in most cases. But then what you do is you assert that there's something extraordinary about the folk that you wish to preserve and present as your core. And then you proceed to describe in great detail what's wonderful about them. And at that point, the comparative element kind of vanishes. So it's about a set of positive attributes that you can't really compare with anything.
Okay, the next question comes from Andreas Schulz regarding the connection between religious and fascist movements. You mentioned the theosophic roots of fascist ideology in the beginning. What about today? Can you say something about the potential for cooperation between not only Indian Hindu groups, but also evangelical and fascist groups in, for example, Brazil or the USA?
I mean, we don't have to talk about this in theory. They're actually collaborating very strongly now. The US version of this is to actually try to fund university posts in so-called Indic subjects. The argument is, in fact, a very post-colonial one. And actually, I think post-colonialism is very compatible with ethno-pluralism. The argument that we must speak for ourselves and outsiders must not speak for us requires you to predefine the we, the ethnic or the Völkisch, whatever you want to call it. Or in fact, the brotherhood or the sisterhood of co-victimhood. But in practice, what happens is an Indic group, something called the Dharma Civilization Foundation. The Hindutva groups have a great number of these front organizations. They argue that just as African-American groups do not wish to be represented by white people, and Jewish groups do not wish to be represented by non-Jews, the Indic must be represented by the Hindu, and therefore it is only the authentically Indic Hindu who should be entitled to teach things on India. All kinds of slippages are going on there. Who do you erase in this definition? But more widely speaking, the form of understanding of evangelical groups as having a core identity which is given to them and that they're entitled to assert is really a question of in what spaces they assert it. And if you look at, we'd call them the new right, but they sound much better in French than Nouvelle Droite. They would argue that it's perfectly all right, for instance, in an area of Muslim majority, say in the middle of Britain, to introduce Sharia law, separate but equal. So there are these divisions of labor going on. As I said, we don't know how this will play out when fascisms are actually competing for space and regimes. But the form of collaboration now is actually more than possible.
Right. I think the question was about that, but also about kind of other horizontal connections outside of India or Indian communities. So, for example, between Brazil and the United States, whether you're observing any of this dynamic that you described taking place, on the American continent, for example.
I mean, I don't think that I'm the best person to answer this question, but I have been following a number of discussions where there is a strong tendency to actually pick up the language of the right in one country and move it to another country and to use it relatively unproblematically across that context. Having said that, I think the interesting part there is how a ready-made and already legitimate position in one context can be moved over to a very different context and used as if it is equal. I'll give you one example from debates that were happening in India in the 1990s. One of the emerging arguments of the Hindu right was always that we are being turned into Jews in our own country. I promise you, I'm not making this up. There are several instances of this, and this became a kind of mantra which was very clearly being used from the fact that the Holocaust turned the Jewish identity into something that was, at least in the 1990s, a priori a victimhood category. So it could be moved from one case to the other.
Right.
This is happening across right wings, but I'm saying that it could actually happen across that right-left divide as well. That's not a very good answer to the specific question of the Americas, but
no, but it does explain the general mechanism. And we do have another question a little later about this sort of shift to ethno-pluralism with the Nouvelle Droite. But I first want to take another follow-up question, in a sense, from Susan Neiman. She says, I would be very interested to hear you talk about the Irish and Indian cases. Ireland seems to have managed to form a strong nationalism without fascism or even xenophobia. Or do you disagree?
I mean, I think anybody who has lived in Ireland would disagree more than I would. I think what is said in everyday activist politics is that Ireland appears to have a non-exclusionary nationalism because Ireland has hitherto been pretty homogenous as a population, that the main divide has been Catholic Protestant. And that divide has been reified by politics. It's not necessarily a divide that always played on the ground. But in terms of the seeing of an ancient culture, Ireland has the same tendencies towards romanticizing its Aryan past. And I think that the main collaborators in this, and this is not yet properly researched, are Imre de Valera. And among the Indian activists, Subhash Chandra Bose, who was in Berlin during the Second World War and who spent a lot of time finding his fascist and Nazi connections in the 30s when he was in exile in Europe. And it is already in the 30s that this connection between Bose and de Valera develops. So it's a kind of open question at the moment, and it would require actual archival work, which I hope to be able to do soon. Exactly how far these discussions tended to move in ideological terms. But there's definitely a trend over time, which goes in two directions. The Irish-Indian collaboration happens from a center to the left in terms of the common oppression in the hands of English imperialism. It happens in terms of a support for each other's movements of violent resistance, but it also happens in terms of a kind of Völkisch fascist identity.
Right, thanks. So I just want to remind people, because I think a few more viewers have joined us, that you're very welcome to ask questions. And in order to do so, please type in your question, not using the chat function, but using the Q&A button that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And then they'll be visible to us. So I want to take another question that's relatively long from Martin Schade, Deputy Director at the Einstein Forum. And he says, it's actually a set of questions that he says relate to the modes of actual cooperation between different fascisms. So the paradox is that on the one hand, there is this fascist obsession with the supremacy on the authentic genius of one's own people or folk. And on the other hand, there are forms of international conversations and cooperations, which you call disavowed internationalism. And your historical examples in the talk were the Indian programs of the Deutsche Akademie, the DAAD, and the Goethe Institute, or the precursor to the DAAD and the Goethe Institute. As to this particular historical case, may I suggest a rather profane alternative or complementary explanation, one that is not focused on ideological affinity, but rather on strategic expediency. India was simply the most valuable colony in the British Empire, and to establish links with and to strengthen Hindu nationalism there was simply a way of preparing against an enemy in the inevitable war that was to follow. This is not to suggest that the disavowed internationalism you talked about did not exist or does not exist today. It certainly does. And what's more, it is no longer disavowed. Even fascists have a learning curve, adapting their conceptual toolkit accordingly. If today members of the German far right get together with their friends in the Greek Golden Dawn, or with representatives of the identitarian movement in France, they do have something truly internationalist that they can agree on, namely ethno-pluralism or global apartheid. Does that concept play a role in India?
So there's a very clear indication that in India now, the Hindu right reaches out to especially the European right-wing parties. There's a very concrete recent example, which is that the right wing of the European Parliament sent representatives to Kashmir shortly after the autonomous status of Kashmir was removed and Kashmir was effectively under military occupation and lockdown. It's been a military occupied zone for many years, but this was intensified. And only the members of the European right wing of the European Parliament were allowed in when journalists were being excluded. And they, of course, went back home and said there's nothing wrong at all. So obviously, there are many more examples of contemporary attempts to collaborate among a global right. And I think it's correct to say that this is enabled by this idea of so-called ethno-pluralism. Everybody has their own space, and I can support your fascism, which I would hate if it were here, as long as it's not here and it's somewhere else. That's definitely true. I want to go back to the first question, though, and disagree strongly about this idea that this is somehow simply pragmatic. Perhaps you could argue that, say, from the Nazi side, to try and find connections in the colonies of the British Empire is good practice. Just as it is good practice both for fascists and Nazis to look for ideological affinities in South America and to try and mobilize, say, people of Italian origin in Argentina. I'm thinking of the work of Federico Finkelstein. But that doesn't quite explain why so many people from the periphery are keen not only to collaborate, but also to explain how they already have the ideas that the Nazis want, how they can in fact amplify and enhance the ideas of the Nazis. I recently read a very interesting piece in Post-Colonial Mode, which talks about my main fascist ideologue, Binoy Sarkar, having essentially invented the idea of the geopolitical expansion that was advocated by people like Karl Haushofer. In other words, the Nazis learned from the Indians, and in post-colonial mode, this is something to be excited about. In my non-post-colonial mode, all it indicates is that there are certainly people who believe that the ideas that go into a kind of right-wing to fascist set of movements at the beginning of the 20th century have material in it that everybody can use. So I think that if you start to think of the Second World War, then you can start to think of opportunist alliances and enemy's enemy alliances. But it doesn't explain why people are so excited from the 20s to the 40s about the possibilities of fascism for non-European countries, for smaller European countries. Fortunately or unfortunately, fascism was one of the major ideologies of the first half of the 20th century. And it's very easy to forget that and then to use a model where there are greater and lesser fascisms, and there are people who understood it fully and there are people who instrumentalized it. Instrumental is a very strange way of seeing it. We do not know whether every member of the NSDAP was convinced philosophically by anything. Historians are not capable of getting into people's heads in retrospect, so they have to rely on what people stand for in public.
So I think maybe as a thought experiment, conversely, it would be interesting to think about whether there were any instances, say in the 20s, when someone developed a set of fascist or fascistoid ideas in their own geographical setting, and those ideas were completely rejected by other fascists simply because that person was a representative of some, minor or uninteresting nation. Have you ever come across anything like that?
No, not consciously, but I think the answer there would be that if it is so small and insignificant, then it's not interesting to other fascisms. I think what becomes interesting is when, say, a set of ideas becomes really important and then starts to seek affinities and alliances. It's not worthwhile to promote non-entities. Having said that, in the very early days of the Nazi Party, somebody referred to in British intelligence files as the Bavarian extremist leader Hitler, was inviting various colonial subjects to a house in Munich to try and find out what it was that they could agree on for a future Nazi movement. So it's not actually that clear that that the lines are not being attempted to be drawn. People are seeking affinities very early on.
Yeah. No, I do think that this goes to show that this strong exclusionism that we tend to associate with these ideologies does still allow for a lot of ideological flexibility. And I mean, I worked a little bit on the new right in the 80s and 90s when connections between Eastern and Western Europe were once again being forged.
Yeah.
And it was really fascinating to see how when some original idea or supposedly original idea emerged in one country, the far right in other countries tended to almost immediately jump on this and find very clever ways of explaining why this country, even though it might be seen as an enemy, can still be a source of really interesting radical right ideas which might kind of enter the edifice of the general new right. So, and I think this goes for different historical periods.
I mean, I had a short response to this, although I understand this more comment. This is what actually probably got Ernst Nolte into trouble, where he started trying to make the claim that fascisms are simply a response to communism, but where there was, at least in what was translated into English as Three Faces of Fascism, he tried actually to show that there was a French fascism. Now, obviously, by the time there is a Europe-wide fascism, there is a much clearer French fascism than for the early period that he tries to talk about. Incidentally, a number of the writers of that Action Française tendency were and are very popular in India, and were translated into school children's textbooks, just as a manner of establishing that the connections are deeper than we think.
Right. Okay, I'm not actually seeing any more questions in the window, which I hope is not due to, oh, there is one now. Okay, so I'm going to read that out right away. This is from Tawfiq Hamad. Once again, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. He says, a novelist said earlier, India is rapidly slipping into neo-fascism. Can you explain it according to Indian context, especially the present situation? There might be some typos there, but I think you get the gist.
Yeah, I get that. I think that rapidly slipping into is an outdated thing to say. India is in fascism. Well, you have a regime phase, you have a very strong tendency towards the abolition of civil rights. Every intellectual now can be arrested. There's still the facade of actually trying to pretend there's some charge against them. But a student activist who gives a speech being arrested on a murder charge, and nobody even knows what the murder is now beyond the realms of any kind of attempt at procedure. There is no more independent judiciary. The judiciary is appointed by the government effectively. There is really no space left when journalists are also not allowed to function for any dissent to show itself. What little that we are still able to know comes from a variety of very difficult sources, and people are reporting at considerable risk. So I think that, it's not slipping into fascism, it is in fascism. Let's get that clear. Now, the comment about why it's fascism and not neo-fascism is, for me, interesting, because the RSS, which is the longest running fascist organization in the world, has never been discredited, has never really been disbanded, and has never really, at least internally, changed its vocabulary. So if you like what paleontologists want to call a living fossil, go and look at the RSS, because there hasn't been much change within. So the fact that a fascist organization is the power behind the government is also very interesting. I want to propose one comparison which I think might be interesting, in that the Nazis at least disarmed the SR when they had a regime phase. One vague source of hope is that the RSS is still very strong, which means that the BJP doesn't believe it has any legitimacy as yet. But we know that under cover of darkness and blackouts, and when we emerge from these blackouts due to the COVID-19 virus, there will be a lot less space for any kind of democratic politics to operate. I could go on, but I think the main point that you were making is that, is India slipping into neo-fascism? No, it is not neo-fascism, it is fascism, and it is there already.
Maybe as a quick rejoinder to that, I mean, without any profound knowledge of the Indian situation, I do think about countries like Russia, which some people also want to call fascist regimes. And in those cases, I think this is completely misguided, because even though the kinds of things that you just mentioned could also happen there, or do happen on a regular basis, in fact, people being imprisoned on completely trumped up charges because they pose the challenge, they don't happen systematically. So it's an unpredictable situation where something like this could always happen, but it doesn't always happen. And I don't know whether it's like that in India, but isn't that still a significant difference between, a fully fledged fascist situation and something that's much closer to authoritarianism. And I don't mean it just as a terminological distinction, but as, the way in which these things affect people's daily lives.
Well, an authoritarian system still has some kind of pretense of democracy. Now, you can argue again in terms of a sliding scale when you cross a line. I don't think that we want to wait till it crosses a line. But I want to actually disagree about the question of whether oppression, persecution of intellectuals, and so on works at that level. I'm thinking of Peter Gay's late book called My German Question. Mm-hmm. And it's about growing up as a Jewish boy who can pass as an Aryan in Nazi Berlin. And he talks about how actually oppression is not continuous, it's sporadic, and it's targeted in ways that you could always believe that if you learned to keep quiet and to conform, nothing would happen to you. Now, this is exactly, say, when the BJP won its first election in 1914 to celebrate, I think they killed only 2 Muslims and burnt only 1 mosque. I may be wrong, it may be 1 Muslim. But then the pogroms become systematic, the targeted lynchings become more regular. The vigilante groups, which can of course always be disowned at will, increase. And the fundamental question is always, do you need this show of extra legal force at all times to control your population? How long do you need it for? And so I think the instructive place to look is not in a kind of mature fascist or Nazi state. The instructive place to look for the way fascism is operating now, or tendencies that might easily become fascism, is to look at how they act as they consolidate power. One more quick point where I'm thinking again of a book by Federico Finkelstein called On Populism and Fascism. And he makes a distinction between left-wing populism, which takes a lot of shortcuts with what its message needs to be, and a right-wing populism, which needs to pretend democracy in order to get rid of democracy. So this performance and repetition of this is the people's will, which you get ad nauseum in a number of these regimes, that is something to watch out for. I don't really know the Russian case well enough to be able to comment on whether, in fact, people are self-censoring to the level that they are in India. Because my profession, that of the historian, has all but vanished from India. Everybody is either shutting up or saying something totally harmless.
There are certainly tendencies like that in Russia. I wouldn't say it's a total phenomenon yet, but certainly there are very, very strong tendencies in that direction.
We have another question. Be another one.
Yeah. Yes. We have another question from Martin Schad. In your talk, he says, you mentioned that Hitler's Mein Kampf, or in your version, Mein Month, is readily available in India. Do Indian school curricula deal with German Nazism? And if so, how?
They used to. They used to deal with it as a kind of blip in the history of the world. But it was very clear that this was a racially identified state. Unfortunately, even in school teaching, which, to be frank, was not very well done, there was always the room for the teacher who said, well, the Nazis did some terrible things, but Hitler was a good nationalist. And he wanted the best for the German people. Now, I mean, most German travelers in India are still always confronted with, we love your great leader. And they don't quite know what to do about it. But some of them try to enlighten their interlocutors, and most are just horrified. I think also there are little ways around what Mein Kampf really meant, because there was, incidentally, during the lockdown, one survey points out that the most popular book to have read during the lockdown in India was Mein Kampf. This is a skewed sample, but it's interesting that people who would respond to a survey like this would want to tell you that they've been reading Mein Kampf. Okay? And it's also sold, I quote, Jaiko Books says it's a management textbook. So there are ways of spinning it. There's no doubt that Hitler is a major figure. I'm quite sure that it's not possible to have come through a school education without knowing what the Nazis were. You could know it better or worse. I am quite sure also that we're not talking here about how terrible this all was, because there are a great number of people in India today who believe that the Nazis did the right thing to the Jews and they should, in fact, kill Muslims the way the Nazis killed Jews. This, by the way, seems to go effortlessly together with the idea that the BJP-ruled Hindu nationalist state should model itself on the Israeli Zionist state. So there's a lot of strange historical examples being drawn.
Maybe to go back to the specific question about school curricula and textbooks. So what exactly is the place of Nazi Germany in the historical narrative? And I'm asking this because I'm doing some research right now on Soviet and post-Soviet textbooks and on the way that the Second World War is represented there. And it has a strong quantitative component where I'm simply looking at, how many pages are devoted to what,
Mm-hmm.
and what is the title. And I noticed that there's a strong difference between textbooks on international global history,
Mm-hmm.
where you get almost a Western style narrative of, the rise of National Socialism, which led to the Second World War, and then all these different countries were involved, etc. And textbooks on the different national histories of, whatever state it is that's using these textbooks, where basically, in 1941, out of the blue, some unknowable power attacks the Soviet Union, and then people heroically respond. So what is the relationality? Is there kind of a strong Indian lens through which Nazi Germany is read, or are there attempts to present kind of a neutralized narrative of global history?
And I think that in the school textbooks that were around until 10 years ago, what you said would probably be correct. There's a kind of generic narrative of European and non-Indian history, which would conform to what you would expect in a school textbook. It would give you the main lines of development. Today, of course, these textbooks are being abolished, and existing textbooks with the existing title are being interjected into by fascist state governments. They will remove a character here, add a character here. They are not actually really doing the logical step of writing entirely new textbooks. But in the Indian history textbooks in the state of Gujarat, the first Indian Prime Minister Nehru has allegedly vanished from the textbooks. So, as I said, history as a field is it's under attack because it is seen as a danger to the fascists. But it is also strange how many of my colleagues have made their peace with this. In terms of the narrative lenses, I think probably the encounter with Nazism would have come in the generation that is now politically fascist from textbooks which would have largely been unproblematic. The ability to relate that so-called external history to the history of the nation and the folk is not really very present. It's, I think we need to draw a strong distinction between schools and universities, and then again between university education that has a sciences and a social sciences background. I think I'm not exaggerating when I say that the sciences and the technological side of education in India is deliberately ignorant about the social sciences side, and you would find actually a lot of the mythologizing about race coming from people who, because they're scientists, would be expected not to be so hung up on that sort of thing.
Hence the idea that Indians had nuclear power 3,000 years ago.
Well, that has been something that has been very disturbing for the scientific community in India,
Okay.
because they believe that they're being turned into a laughing stock in the world. Now, one of the exports that comes from a country like India is technology, technologists. And the more this government turns them into fools, and the more they are afraid for their jobs. So this is a slight rift opening up among people who have been less than self-consciously knee-jerk nationalist about the Hindu right.
Okay, that is a little bit of an optimistic note to end on, maybe, because this is as much time as we have. Thank you very much, Benjamin, for agreeing to answer these questions and for taking part in this little experiment of ours. We hope that this will have been the first in a series of both online lectures and webinars. And I would like to thank everyone for listening and asking questions, and also to invite everyone to check the Einstein Forum's website regularly for updates, video lectures, video interviews with our Einstein Fellowship alumni. And I hope to see many of you soon, maybe even at the Einstein Forum in Potsdam, when that is possible again. Thanks, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I know there are a lot of political economy questions we could have raised, but thank you for being so patient with me.
There'll be a next time, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.